The blood on the rocks was the first sign that the storm had brought more than just rain. Down in the canyon, where the wind screamed like a banshee, Cassandra O'Malley saw the dark stain, impossibly black, against the wet grey granite. It wasn't animal. The trail of it, smeared and desperate, led to a crumpled shape huddled against the base of a fallen cottonwood. A man. His life was pouring out of him, painting the thirsty Arizona soil a grim, muddy crimson. She knew what any sensible person would do: turn back, bolt the cabin door, and pretend she'd seen nothing. Bandits, outlaws, or worse, the territory was full of them. But her late father, a doctor from the old country, had taught her that a life was a life. So with a deep breath that tasted of rain and ozone, she clutched the hunting knife at her belt and started down the treacherous slope, stepping toward a decision that would either be her salvation or her doom. The sky over the Dragoon Mountains had been bruised purple for 2 days, a sullen, angry color that promised violence. For Cassandra O'Malley alone, in the small, sturdy cabin her husband had built before a fever took him, the weather was just another adversary to be endured. She was a woman carved from the same stubborn rock as the canyon she called home. Her hands, though slender, were calloused from tilling her small garden, mending fences, and handling the hefty Winchester that now leaned against her doorframe. When the storm finally broke, it was with the fury of a betrayed god. Rain didn't fall. It hammered, turning her well-trodden paths into churning streams of mud. Thunder cannonaded off the canyon walls, each clap a physical blow that shook the very timbers of her home. It was in the brief, trembling silence, after one particularly deafening peal, that she heard it, a sound that did not belong. Not the cry of a coyote or the scream of a cougar. It was a single sharp crack, thin and metallic, swallowed almost instantly by the next roll of thunder. A rifle shot. Cassie froze her hand, hovering over the pot of stew simmering on the hearth. Her homestead was isolated, deliberately so. The nearest town, Harmony Creek, was a half-day's ride east, and her closest neighbors were the ghosts of the Chiricahua Apache, who once called this land sacred. No one came out this way unless they were lost or they were looking for trouble. For an hour she waited, listening to the storm symphony and nothing more. The stew went cold. The fire dwindled to embers. Finally convincing herself the wind had been playing tricks, she unbolted the door to gather more wood from the covered lean-to. The air was cold and charged thick with the smell of wet pine and damp earth. And that's when she saw it. The trail of blood starting near the ridge and winding its way down the slick, treacherous rocks into the arroyo below. Against every instinct of self-preservation that screamed at her to retreat and bar the door, she grabbed a thick oilcloth cloak and her knife. She was no fool. She knew the dangers. But the image of her father, his brow furrowed in concentration as he set a broken bone or stitched a wound, was seared into her memory. To ignore a soul in need, Cassie girl, he used to say, is to let a small piece of your own soul die. The descent was perilous. Rocks shifted under her boots, and the rain blinded her, but she followed the grisly trail until she found him. He was Apache. There was no mistaking the high cheekbones, the long jet-black hair plastered to his face, or the simple leather breeches he wore. He was young, perhaps her own age of 26, and built with a lean, corded strength that was now failing him. A dark, ragged hole in his side oozed blood, and a second wound, a deep gash on his forehead, had left him unconscious. He lay half-submerged in the muddy water, one hand still clenched around the handle of a knife. For a heartbeat, fear warred with compassion. The Apache were a people of rumor and terror in towns like Harmony Creek. Savages, they called them. But looking at the man, Cassie saw no monster. She saw a fellow human being bleeding out at the bottom of a canyon. Damn it all to hell! She muttered the oath a prayer. Getting him back to the cabin was a Herculean task. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She heaved and dragged, slipping in the mud, her muscles screaming in protest. The half-mile journey felt like an eternity. By the time she hauled him over the threshold, she was trembling with exhaustion, soaked to the bone and covered in his blood and the canyon's mud. She barred the door and dragged him close to the fire, stripping away his soaked leather. His body was a tapestry of old scars, telling a story of a life of conflict. But it was the new wound that held her attention. The bullet had gone clean through a blessing of sorts, but he'd lost a dangerous amount of blood, and fever was already setting in. Working by the flickering firelight, Cassie fell back on her father's lessons. She washed the wound with boiled water and whiskey, a precious commodity she rarely touched. He groaned, his body tensing, but he didn't wake. She packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow to staunch the bleeding and willow bark for the fever. She tore strips from one of her late husband's clean shirts to bandage his ribs tightly. She cleaned the gash on his head and stitched it closed with a fine needle and gut her hands, moving with a surgeon's steady precision. For 3 days and 3 nights the storm raged outside, and a different kind of storm raged within the cabin. The man drifted in and out of a fevered delirium, muttering words in a language she didn't understand. She forced broth and willow bark tea between his lips, cooled his brow with damp cloths, and listened to the tempest outside, praying it would muffle any sounds from within should anyone be looking for him. She was keenly aware of the risk she was taking. Harboring an Apache, a wounded warrior no less, was a crime punishable by the rough justice of the frontier, a rope. But every time she looked at his face, softened in unconsciousness, she knew she couldn't have done anything else. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. The sun streamed through her small window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. And for the first time, the man's eyes opened. They were not the hazy, unfocused eyes of a fever patient, but the sharp, intelligent, and intensely wary eyes of a predator. The silence in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. The Apache warrior lay on the pallet, his dark eyes tracking Cassie's every movement as she stoked the fire. He didn't speak, not a single word. He simply watched, his gaze unblinking and unnervingly perceptive, as if he were cataloguing her strengths and weaknesses. The patient was gone. The warrior was awake. Cassie's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced a calm she didn't feel moving about her daily chores, as if tending to a wounded Apache was the most natural thing in the world. She ladled stew into a bowl, the aroma of rabbit and wild herbs filling the small space. She approached him, slowly holding out the bowl. "You need to eat," she said, her voice even, "to get your strength back." He stared at the bowl, then back at her. His eyes narrowed slightly. He pushed himself up into a sitting position, a barely perceptible wince crossing his face as the movement pulled at his bandaged side. He glanced at the clean dressing, then at the neat stitches on his forehead, his fingers gently tracing their path. His gaze returned to hers, and for the first time, the raw hostility was replaced by a flicker of something else. Confusion, perhaps even grudging respect. He took the bowl. He ate with a deliberate, efficient hunger, never taking his eyes off her. When he was finished, he set the empty bowl on the floor. "Why?" he asked. His voice was a low rasp, rough from disuse, but his English was clear, almost unaccented, which surprised her more than anything. "You were bleeding to death," she replied, simply taking the bowl. "I couldn't leave you in the rain." He seemed to consider this, his expression unreadable. "They will kill you for this." The white eyes. "If they find me here." "Then they won't find you here," she said, her chin jutting out with a stubbornness that was her defining trait. For a week they lived in this state of quiet tension. He never told her his name, and she never asked. To her, he was simply the stranger. He spoke very little, but he observed everything. He watched how she checked the perimeter of her cabin each morning, how she cleaned her Winchester with practiced ease, how she could predict the weather by the ache in her bones. He saw the sorrow that sometimes clouded her eyes when she looked at the empty rocking chair by the fire, the one her husband Daniel had made. In turn, she saw the man beneath the warrior. She saw the discipline in the way he began to move as he healed his movements, fluid and silent. She saw the intelligence in his eyes as he watched her read from her father's worn medical journal. One evening he pointed to the book. "He teaches you to heal." "He did," Cassie said softly. "My father was a doctor. He believed knowledge was meant to be shared." The stranger nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement. His healing was preternaturally fast. The fever had broken completely, and the wound in his side was closing cleanly without infection. He began to help his contributions, silent but meaningful. He would rise before her, his footsteps, making no sound on the wooden floor, and whittle shavings for the fire. He once found a loose board in her small barn, and fixed it without a word. Another day, he returned from a short walk into the canyon, the first time he'd left the immediate vicinity of the cabin, and presented her with a handful of medicinal roots she hadn't been able to find, leaving them on the table, before retreating to his corner. They were two solitary souls, orbiting each other in the confines of the small cabin, a man from a world of war parties and ancient traditions, and a woman from a world of homesteads and lonely resilience. A strange, unspoken bond formed between them, forged not in words, but in shared silence and mutual respect. She had saved his life, a debt he could not yet repay. He, in turn, had brought a living, breathing presence into her crushing solitude, a reminder that the world was larger than her small patch of land. Then one morning, a week after he had woken, she emerged from the cabin to find him gone. There was no sign of his departure. The pallet where he slept was neatly arranged. The cabin was as it was. It was as if he had been a phantom, a figment of her storm-addled imagination. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her for a moment. Had he been a threat after all? Was he coming back with others? But then she saw it resting on the smooth, flat top of the fence post nearest the door. It was a small, intricately carved bird whittled from a piece of cottonwood. Its wings were outstretched, poised for flight. It was a perfect, beautiful thing crafted with patience and skill. She picked it up her fingers, tracing the smooth lines. It wasn't a threat. It was a message. A thank you. A farewell. An acknowledgement of the debt. She clutched the small bird in her hand, the wood warming against her skin, and stared out at the vast, empty canyon. The silence that descended was heavier and more profound than it had been before. The stranger was gone, and Cassandra O'Malley was once again completely and utterly alone. She didn't know if that was a relief or a new kind of loss. The peace that followed the stranger's departure was fragile and short-lived. For a few weeks, Cassie fell back into the familiar rhythm of her solitary life. The memory of the wounded Apache felt almost dreamlike, the only tangible proof of his existence, the small wooden bird she now kept on her mantelpiece. But the frontier was not a place that allowed for prolonged tranquility. Trouble like a dust storm on the horizon was always coming. It arrived in the form of 3 riders, their horses churning up the dust of the canyon floor. Cassie saw them from the ridge where she was checking her snares. They weren't soldiers or prospectors. They rode with a swaggering, predatory arrogance, their clothes caked with trail dust, their faces hard and sun-scorched. She recognized the man in the lead instantly. Jedodiah Cain. Cain was a man who cast a long and dirty shadow over the region. He and his so-called Black Creek gang were officially ranchers, but everyone in Harmony Creek knew their real business was rustling intimidation and anything else that could turn a dishonest dollar. Cain himself was a big man running to fat, with a florid face and small, greedy eyes that missed nothing. He had tried to buy her land twice before, after her husband died. He'd offered a pittance, his voice slick with false sympathy, but his eyes had held a cold avarice that had chilled her to the bone. She had refused politely, but firmly. She scrambled back to the cabin, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. She slid the heavy bar across the door and took up her Winchester, checking the load with trembling hands. She moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. The three men dismounted their spurs, jingling with a sound that felt like a death knell. Cain swaggered up to her porch as if he owned it. "Cassandra O'Malley." He boomed, his voice falsely jovial. "I know you're in there. No need to be inhospitable. Just a friendly visit." Cassie remained silent, the rifle stock cold and solid against her shoulder. Cain's smile tightened. "Now listen here. I'm a patient man, but my patience is wearing thin. I came to make you my final offer for this worthless scrap of rock." "It's not for sale, Mr. Cain." She called out, her voice steady, despite the fear coiling in her gut. "That's my final answer." One of Cain's men, a wiry weasel of a man named Pike, spat a stream of tobacco juice near her doorstep. "Worthless," he sneered. "Jed, maybe you should tell the lady what makes this patch of dirt so special." Cain shot him a venomous look before turning his attention back to the cabin. His greasy smile returned. "My associate is right. You see, Mrs. O'Malley, you've been sitting on something far more valuable than grazing land. My men, they did some exploring up in your canyon a few months back. Found the source of this little creek of yours. It's no ordinary spring. It's a gusher. Never runs dry, not even in the heat of summer. Water, Mrs. O'Malley. In this territory, water is more valuable than gold." The blood drained from Cassie's face. She knew her spring was reliable, but she hadn't understood its true significance. In a land defined by drought, a perennial water source was a kingdom. "This land is mine," she said, her voice harder now. "The deed is filed and legal in Prescott. You have no claim." Cain laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet canyon. "Legal, ma'am, out here. The law is what a man with enough guns says it is. And I have the guns." He gestured around the canyon. "No one's coming to help you. The circuit judge won't be through for 6 months. The sheriff in Harmony Creek is a useless old drunk. You're all alone." He stepped onto the porch, his heavy boots thudding on the wood. "I'm offering you $500. You take it, you ride out, and you forget this place ever existed. You don't—" He let the threat hang in the air, more menacing than any explicit words. Well, accidents happen. A fire, a stray bullet during a hunt. A woman alone is a fragile thing. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was mingled with a hot, surging rage. This was her home. Daniel had poured his sweat and blood into this land. She had survived his loss, survived the loneliness, survived the harshness of the elements. She would not be driven off by this pig of a man. "Get off my property, Mr. Cain," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Get off now, or the next thing you hear will be this Winchester talking." For a moment, Cain looked genuinely surprised. Then his face contorted in a mask of fury. "You stupid woman. You just signed your own death warrant." He stormed off the porch, his men following. They mounted their horses, and Cain turned in his saddle, his eyes promising retribution. "We'll be back, O'Malley," he snarled. "And when we come back, we won't be knocking." She watched them ride away, their figures shrinking against the vast landscape, until they were gone. Only then did she allow herself to sink to the floor, the heavy rifle across her lap. The silence of the canyon returned, but it was different now. It was no longer peaceful. It was watchful, menacing, filled with the shadow of Jedodiah Cain and his promise to return. She was well and truly alone, and for the first time she was terrified. The law was a distant concept, and her neighbors were miles away. Her only protector was the steel and wood in her hands. She looked at the small carved bird on the mantel, a relic from a different kind of danger, and wondered if she had traded a phantom threat for a very real one. The dust from Cain's horses had barely settled before Cassie made her decision. Hope was a stubborn weed, and her hope for now lay in Harmony Creek and the tin star of its sheriff. She couldn't defend the homestead forever on her own. She needed the law. The next morning at dawn, she saddled her mare, slipped a small pistol into her saddlebag, holstered her knife, and rode out the Winchester resting in its scabbard. The ride to Harmony Creek was one she always made with a sense of apprehension. The town was a dusty collection of clapboard buildings, 2 saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, and the sheriff's office, all huddled together, as if for protection against the vast, indifferent wilderness. To the townspeople she was an object of curiosity and suspicion, the widow O'Malley who lived alone in Apache country and kept to herself. They were polite, but distant, their whispers following her like her own shadow. She found Sheriff Brody hunched over a mountain of paperwork, his office smelling of stale coffee and cheap cigars. He was an older man, his face a road map of wrinkles, and his shoulders stooped with the weight of years trying to police an unpoliceable territory. He was a decent man, but he was tired. He looked up as she entered his eyes, showing mild surprise. "Mrs. O'Malley, didn't expect to see you in town. Everything all right out at your place?" Cassie closed the door behind her and laid it out for him, her voice clear and concise. She told him about Cain's visits, his threats, and the discovery of the spring's true value. As she spoke, she saw the weariness in Sheriff Brody's eyes deepen into a kind of pained resignation. When she finished, he sighed, running a hand through his thinning grey hair. "I believe every word you say, ma'am. Jedodiah Cain is a cancer on this county. We all know it. But knowing it and proving it are 2 different things." "He threatened me on my own porch," Cassie insisted. "His men were with him. That's a crime." "Their word against yours." Brody countered, his voice gentle but firm. "Cain owns the biggest ranch for 100 miles. He has a dozen men on his payroll who will swear he was counting cattle all day yesterday. He's got friends in Prescott. He's smart, Cassie. He never leaves a clean trail." "So you're saying you can't do anything?" she asked, a cold dread seeping into her bones. "He's just allowed to threaten and steal and worse. I'm not saying I can't do anything. I'm saying I'm one man with one deputy who's currently laid up with a broken leg," the sheriff said, gesturing helplessly. "Cain has at least 15 hired guns. If I ride out to your place, they'll just lay low until I leave. If I try to arrest him on your word alone, his lawyer will have him out in an hour, and all I'll have done is made him angrier. I need evidence. I need a witness who isn't you, and who isn't scared of him." He leaned forward, his expression grave. "My advice to you, and I mean this for your own good, is to take his offer. $500 is a lot of money. You could start over somewhere safer, somewhere civilized." The words hit her like a slap. So the law's advice is to surrender, to run. The rage that had been simmering since Cain's visit boiled over. "This is my home, Sheriff. My husband is buried there. I'm not running. I admire your grit, Mrs. O'Malley, I truly do." Brody said, his voice full of pity, which was somehow worse than his powerlessness. But grit doesn't stop a bullet. Be careful. Lock your doors. And if you see him coming, you ride. You ride fast and you don't look back. Cassie left the sheriff's office feeling more alone than she had in the deepest isolation of her canyon. The law was a mirage, a comforting idea that vanished when you got close enough. As she walked to the general store to buy supplies, extra cartridges, flour, salt, she could feel the eyes of the townspeople on her. She saw Pike Cain's weaselly henchman loitering outside the saloon. He watched her, a smirk on his face, and tipped his hat in a gesture of pure mockery. He knew. They all knew the sheriff was useless against the likes of Cain. She bought what she needed from the storekeeper, a portly man named Peterson, who avoided her gaze and fumbled with her change. No one offered a kind word. No one asked if she needed help. To them she was already a ghost, a woman tangled up in a fight she couldn't win. Her struggle was an inconvenience, a disturbance to the fragile peace they had brokered with the devil they knew. Riding home, the sun beating down on her Cassie O'Malley understood the terrible truth of the frontier. There was no cavalry coming over the hill. There was no lawman who could save her. She was an island, and the tide was coming in. Her survival depended on one person, and one person alone, herself. The comforting illusions of civilization had been stripped away, leaving only the hard, unvarnished reality. Back in her canyon, she wasn't just defending a piece of land anymore. She was defending her right to exist, and as she looked towards the formidable peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, she knew her fight had only just begun. The weeks that followed were a slow, agonizing tightening of a noose. Jedodiah Cain was playing a cruel game, a war of attrition designed to break her spirit before he broke her body. He didn't launch a full-scale attack. Instead, he sent whispers, omens of violence that crept into her life like a sickness. It began subtly. One morning, she found the fence to her small horse corral, cut the wire, snipped clean through. Her mare was gone. Panic seized her. Without her horse, she was truly trapped. She spent a frantic day tracking the animal, her rifle in hand, expecting an ambush at every turn. She found the mare 3 miles down the canyon, peacefully grazing, an obvious sign that this was not a simple escape, but a message. We can take what is yours whenever we please. A few days later, it was her garden. She awoke to find the entire patch of vegetables, her food for the coming winter, trampled and destroyed. The hoofprints of several shod horses were unmistakable in the tilled earth. They had ridden through it in the night, a deliberate, malicious act of destruction. The psychological toll was immense. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching riders. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden gunman. Sleep became a luxury her nights spent in a half-doze, in a chair by the door, the Winchester across her lap. Her solitude, once a comfort, was now a prison of fear. Yet amidst this campaign of terror, other stranger things began to happen. One evening, as dusk settled, she heard a commotion by her chicken coop. Grabbing her rifle, she crept to the window, expecting to see Pike or one of Cain's other thugs. Instead, she saw a large rattlesnake coiled and hissing its head, drawn back to strike at the flimsy wooden door of the coop. Before she could even raise her rifle, an arrow materialized out of the twilight, silent and swift. It struck the snake's head with pinpoint accuracy, pinning it to the ground. It was over in a second. Cassie scanned the rocks and the trees, her heart hammering, but saw nothing. The canyon was still and empty. She cautiously approached the snake. The arrow was Apache. The fletching was made from hawk feathers, bound with a distinctive pattern of black and red sinew. A few days after that, she was checking her snares, the few that Cain's men hadn't found and destroyed, and found a freshly killed jackrabbit lying on a flat rock nearby. It hadn't been caught in a snare. Its neck was broken cleanly. A gift, a provision. Cassie was a practical woman, not given to flights of fancy. She knew this was no spirit of the canyon protecting her. The signs were too specific, too real. The arrow, the silent provision of food, it was the work of a skilled and stealthy human being. The memory of her stranger, the wounded man she had nursed back to health, rose in her mind. Could it be him? Was he out there watching? The thought was both comforting and terrifying. She was no longer completely alone, but her protector was a ghost, a member of a people her own kind feared and hated. To be found receiving aid from an Apache would be just as damning as harboring one. Her fear of Cain remained, but it was now tempered by a sliver of hope, a fragile thread of connection to the unseen watcher on the ridge. She started leaving a small offering of her own on the fence post, where he had left the carved bird, a strip of dried jerky, a piece of hardtack. The next morning it would be gone. Cain's men grew bolder. One afternoon, Pike and another thug rode right up to her cabin, staying just out of rifle range. They didn't speak. They just sat on their horses and watched her for a solid hour, their faces cold and menacing. It was a naked act of intimidation. Cassie stood on her porch, her rifle held firmly, her knuckles white. She refused to look away, refused to show fear. It was a silent battle of wills fought across 100 yards of dusty earth. When they finally turned and rode off, she felt a profound wave of exhaustion wash over her. How long could she keep this up that night? She couldn't sleep. The moon was a sliver in the sky, and the canyon was unnaturally quiet. She sat at her small kitchen table, cleaning her pistol by lamplight, when a soft thud on the roof made her jump. She froze, listening. Another thud this time, against the side of the cabin. It wasn't a rock. It sounded softer. She crept to the window and peered out. In the pale moonlight, she saw two dark figures near her barn. Cain's men. They were tossing flaming bundles of oil-soaked rags onto the roof of her cabin. Arson. The final desperate act Cain had threatened. Panic flared hot and acidic, but before she could even raise her pistol, two more figures melted out of the shadows of the rocks behind the barn. They moved with a speed and silence that was inhuman. There was the glint of steel, a muffled cry cut short, and then a second. One of Cain's men fell to the ground without a sound. The other turned to run, but a figure was on him in an instant. The fight was brutal, silent, and over in seconds. The two victorious figures dragged the bodies away into the darkness. A moment later, one of them reappeared. He walked calmly to the side of the cabin, climbed onto the roof with the grace of a cat, and smothered the smouldering rags with his bare hands. He stood there for a moment, a silhouette against the starry sky. He was tall and lean, unmistakable. It was him, the stranger. He looked down towards her window, and even in the darkness she felt his gaze meet hers. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he was gone. Cassie leaned against the wall, her body trembling uncontrollably. He was real. He had been here all along, a guardian angel armed with a knife and arrows. The debt was being repaid. But his intervention had changed everything. Cain's simple plan of intimidation had just been met with deadly force. This was no longer a dispute over land. It had escalated into a war, and her small cabin was now the bloody ground on which it would be fought. 3 days passed in an eerie, unnatural calm. The air in the canyon was thick with anticipation, the silence heavier than any storm. Cassie knew it was a lull before a greater violence. Cain would not let the deaths of 2 of his men go unanswered. He would be back, and he would come with overwhelming force. She spent the time fortifying her home, boarding up the smaller window, and creating firing positions. She ate little and slept less. The unseen protector had not shown himself again, and she began to wonder if he had gone for good, his debt now paid in blood. The answer came on the fourth morning. It came not as a whisper, but as a thunderclap. She was outside, drawing water from the well, when a flicker of movement on the high ridge to the west caught her eye. It wasn't one man. It was a line of them. Horsemen. At least 20 sitting motionless on their mounts, their figures stark against the bright morning sky. They weren't Cain's men. They were Apache. Cassie's blood ran cold. She dropped the bucket and scrambled for the cabin, her hand reaching for the Winchester. Had her secret guardian brought his whole tribe? Was this an attack? Had her act of mercy brought ruin upon her? After all, she slammed the door and peered through her peephole, her heart pounding a frantic tattoo against her ribs. The riders began to move, not charging but descending into the canyon in a slow, deliberate procession. They were a terrifyingly beautiful sight, warriors in their prime, armed with rifles and lances, their faces painted for war. They flowed down the familiar slopes like a force of nature, their ponies' hooves making almost no sound. They stopped about 50 yards from her cabin, forming a silent, intimidating semicircle. And then from the center of the line, one rider moved forward. He rode with an authority and presence that set him apart from the others. He wore the simple leather breeches she remembered, but over them he wore a magnificent war shirt, adorned with intricate beadwork and ermine tails. A single eagle feather was tied in his long black hair. It was him, her stranger, but he was transformed. The wounded, guarded man she had nursed was gone. In his place was a leader, a commander, his face stern and proud, his eyes holding the weight of his people. He reined his horse to a halt just beyond the porch and looked at her cabin door as if he could see her through the solid wood. "Woman of the canyon," he called out, his voice ringing with a power she had never heard before. It was the same man, yet entirely different. "You have no need of that rifle. We do not come as enemies to this house." Slowly, hesitantly, Cassie unbarred the door and stepped out onto the porch, her Winchester held loosely in her hands, not aimed but ready. She looked at him, then at the formidable line of warriors behind him. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. A small, grim smile touched his lips. "The man you knew had no name. The man who stands before you is Taza, war chief of the Chiricahua." The name struck her like a physical blow. Taza. She had heard the name whispered in Harmony Creek, a name linked to raids to resistance to the ghost-like bands that the army could never pin down. But the stories never matched the man she had healed. "My father, Kochise's great lieutenant, has passed to the spirit world." Taza continued, his voice resonating with both sorrow and strength. "The council has spoken. I now lead our people." It all clicked into place. The reason he was alone, wounded. He had likely been on a journey, a vision quest, or a private mission when he was ambushed. "The men who shot you," Cassie said, finding her voice. "Were they Cain's?" Taza's eyes hardened. "They were. Cain has been selling repeating rifles to our enemies, the Mescalero, for months. Faulty rifles that explode in a man's hands. He plays both sides for profit. The ambush was meant to cripple us, to remove me, before I could take my father's place. They left me for dead. They did not count on you." He dismounted, his movements fluid and commanding. He walked toward the porch, stopping at the bottom step. He was closer now, and she could see the change in him was more than just his clothing. There was a new fire in his eyes, an ancient authority. The debt between them had been a personal one. Now it was something far greater. "Jedodiah Cain is a disease," Taza said, his voice dropping to a low, intense growl. "He poisons the land and the people on it, both yours and mine. He killed my warriors with his treachery. He tries to drive you from your home, to steal your water. His evil touches all, and it ends today." "He's coming back," Cassie said, her gaze sweeping over his warriors. "He'll bring all his men." "We know," Taza said simply. "We have watched. We have waited. This is not your fight alone, Cassandra O'Malley. You saved the heart of my people when you saved me. Now my people will save your home. This canyon will be the reckoning place. Cain will come for you, but he will find us." He looked directly into her eyes, and the gulf between their two worlds seemed to shrink. He was no longer a stranger, nor just a chief. He was an ally bound to her by a shared enemy and an unlikely bond of honor. She looked past him at the silent warriors waiting on his command, their painted faces a promise of the violence to come. The final act was about to begin. The law of Harmony Creek had failed her, but a far older, more brutal form of justice had just arrived on her doorstep. The sun was high and mercilessly hot when the dust appeared on the eastern horizon. Cain was coming. There was no subterfuge, no stealthy approach. He was riding in with his entire force, 15 men bristling with rifles and pistols, an army of thugs, moving with the swaggering confidence of men who believed their numbers made them invincible. They believed they were coming to crush one lone woman. Inside the cabin, Cassie knelt by the window, her rifle resting on the sill. The air was still and thick with a palpable tension. The cabin, her home, had been transformed into a fortress, the epicenter of a storm she could not have imagined. Taza's plan had been simple and deadly. His warriors were not in sight. They had melted into the rocks and scrub of the canyon, becoming part of the landscape they knew so well. They were ghosts in the daylight, silent, patient, and waiting. Taza himself was with 2 of his best men in the rocks directly overlooking the cabin, a perfect vantage point to command the unfolding battle. Cassie's role was crucial. She was the bait. As Cain's gang drew closer, their coarse laughter and jeers echoed off the canyon walls. They fanned out surrounding the small homestead. Jedodiah Cain himself trotted his horse forward, stopping a safe distance away. "O'Malley," he roared, his face flushed with triumph. "Your time is up. I gave you a chance. Now you can either walk out of there and leave everything, or we'll burn it to the ground with you inside." Cassie's heart hammered, but her hands were steady on her rifle. She remembered Taza's final instruction. "Wait for my signal. Do not fire until the hawk cries." She remained silent, letting Cain's arrogance build. Pike the weaselly thug rode forward and dismounted carrying a torch. "Let's smoke the rat out, Jed," he cackled. As Pike approached the porch, a high, piercing cry echoed from the cliffs above. The call of a red-tailed hawk. The signal. Before Cain could even register the sound, the world erupted. The first arrow took Pike in the throat, silencing his laugh in a wet gurgle. He dropped the torch and clawed at his neck before collapsing. Simultaneously, the canyon walls came alive. Arrows and bullets rained down on the stunned outlaws from a dozen different unseen positions. It was chaos. Horses screamed and reared, throwing their riders. Men yelled in confusion, and pain firing wildly at enemies they couldn't see. One of Cain's men clutched his chest, a feathered shaft protruding from it, and toppled from his saddle. Another had his rifle shot out of his hands as a bullet ricocheted off the rocks beside him. Cassie took a deep breath, aimed, and fired. Her shot was true, striking one of the outlaws in the shoulder and sending him spinning to the ground. She worked the lever, ejected the spent cartridge, and fired again. She was no longer just a victim. She was a combatant, defending her home, with a cold, focused fury. Cain, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, bellowed at his men to take cover. But there was no cover. Tarza's warriors were masters of this terrain. They fired, moved, and fired again, their positions constantly shifting, making them seem like a force 3 times their actual number. The fight was a symphony of destruction, the sharp crack of rifles, the deadly whisper of arrows, and the screams of dying men. Within minutes, half of Cain's gang was down. The rest were panicked, trapped in a perfect crossfire. Cain, realizing the fight was lost, spurred his horse, trying to break for the mouth of the canyon. But Tarza had anticipated this. As Cain galloped past a narrow gap in the rocks, Tarza himself seemed to rise from the earth, leaping from a high ledge directly onto Cain's horse. The horse bucked, throwing both men to the ground. The wider battle fell away as all eyes turned to the 2 leaders. Cain, burly and enraged, scrambled to his feet, drawing a large bowie knife. Tarza rose more slowly, pulling his own knife, his movements economical and deadly. The final confrontation would be a primal one, decided by steel and will. Cain charged, roaring, swinging his knife in a wild arc. Tarza sidestepped the clumsy attack with ease, the big man stumbling past him. Cain turned his face purple with exertion and fury. He lunged again. This time Tarza met him. The knives flashed in the sun, a deadly dance of parries and thrusts. For all his size, Cain was no match for the Apache chief's speed and skill. Tarza was a blur of motion, weaving and dodging, his blade flicking out like a serpent's tongue, leaving small bloody cuts on Cain's arms and face. Cain grew more desperate, his swings wilder. It ended with brutal swiftness. Cain overcommitted on a powerful downward slash. Tarza deflected the blow, spun inside the big man's reach, and drove his knife deep into Cain's side, the same spot where Tarza himself had been shot. Cain gasped, his eyes wide with shock. He looked down at the hilt protruding from his ribs, then back at Tarza. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a bloody gurgle emerged. He sank to his knees and then collapsed face first into the dust he had tried so desperately to own. A profound silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the nervous stamping of horses. The surviving outlaws, seeing their leader fall, threw down their weapons in surrender. It was over. Cassie slowly lowered her rifle, her ears ringing. She stepped out onto her porch, surveying the carnage. The battle had been swift, brutal, and decisive. Tarza walked over to where she stood, retrieving his knife and wiping it clean on the dead man's shirt. He looked at her, his face grim, but his eyes clear. "It is done," he said. "The poison is cut out." His warriors emerged from the rocks, gathering the surrendered men and their weapons. There was no celebration, only a quiet, somber efficiency. Tarza looked around at the canyon, at the small cabin, and the well-tended land around it. "This is good land," he said. "You have a strong spirit to hold it." "I had help," Cassie replied, her gaze meeting his. He nodded, acknowledging her words. The debt was paid. But something new had been forged in its place. Not romance, not a simple alliance, but a deep and abiding respect between 2 survivors from different worlds, a man who led a nation and a woman who refused to abandon her home. "My people will trouble you no more," Tarza declared. "This canyon, this spring, it is yours. The Chiricahua will honor the woman who saved their chief." He turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted, gave one last, long look at Cassandra O'Malley, and then, with a sharp command to his warriors, he led them away, disappearing back into the mountains as quietly as they had arrived. Cassie stood on her porch for a long time, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air, the silence of the canyon slowly returning. It was her canyon again. Truly hers. She had faced down death and had not flinched. She looked down at her calloused hands, then up at the vast, blue Arizona sky. She was alone, but for the first time in a very long time, she was not lonely. She was home. And so the story of Cassandra O'Malley and the Apache chief became another whisper on the wind, a tale of courage born from the harsh realities of the frontier. It's a testament to the idea that alliances can be forged in the most unlikely of circumstances, and that true justice doesn't always wear a tin star or speak from a judge's bench. Sometimes it rides in on the back of a horse, announced by the cry of a hawk, to repay a debt of honor. Her story reminds us that the Wild West wasn't just a conflict between cowboys and Indians, but a complex tapestry of individual lives, of desperate choices, and the quiet, unyielding strength of those who simply refuse to be broken. If this story from the forgotten corners of the American West stirred something in you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a real story of grit and survival, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We have so many more tales to tell, lost histories waiting to be uncovered. Click the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the past. Thank you for listening.